Did you put all the Sangsi B group on censor stamina? The Korean War, possibly the greatest tragedy in Korean history, saw massive Chinese intervention. Korea, on the brink of unification, ultimately retreated and never unified again. What if China hadn't intervened and Korea had unified by advancing north? Let's examine the potential situation that could have unfolded. My goal is to become Korea's top YouTuber. I'll be famous soon, so please subscribe now. You'll be among the first to support me before my rise to fame. I'd appreciate it. If China hadn't intervened, unification by advancing north would have been possible. Our troops even reached the Yalu River once. Kim Il-sung fled to Ganggi and was on the verge of collapse. He desperately pleaded with the Soviet Union and China for reinforcements. The Soviets even advised him to flee to Manchuria and establish a government in exile. Had the Chinese army not intervened, unification through northern advancement would have been achievable. But in this scenario, since the Chinese army didn't intervene, unification by advancing north would have been possible. The South Korean army most likely would have achieved unification by advancing north and ended the war between 1950 and 1951. Kim Il-sung would have formed a government in exile in Manchuria as the Soviets suggested, but even with unification, peace likely wouldn't have come immediately. The reason is that right after unification, there probably would have been quite a few partisans remaining in the northern part of the Korean peninsula. If the national army failed to capture or kill Kim Il-sung, they likely would have crossed to Manchuria, formed a government in exile, and led the remaining northern Korean peninsula partisans. It likely would have taken years to eliminate the partisans, who could have potentially continued their activities for over a decade. The reason I'm saying this is because, in fact, in the case of the Korean People's Guerrilla Unit that was active in Jirisan, they continued their activities until 1955, even after the war ended. There are even records of a few individuals who were not wiped out and continued their activities until 1963. This occurred in South Korea, but it would have been more intense in North Korea, not less. Even after unifying the Korean peninsula, Korea would have needed to devote significant national resources to suppress the partisans. In this process, the South Korean military and police would have endured major losses, engaging in vicious, bloody combat and killing each other without mercy. There would have been many cases where entire villages were burned to the ground. In this situation, occasional limited uprisings would have occurred in some areas due to remnant communist rebels. Of course, the surrounding powers wouldn't have just stood by and watched this happen. If the whole Korean peninsula had united under democracy, Korea would have been a crucial part of United States' diplomatic strategy beyond just an ally. Most notably, its geopolitical position has changed dramatically. With northern unification, South Korea would be the sole United States ally bordering China and the Soviet Union directly. This would have strategically benefited the United States while threatening the security of the Soviet Union and China. Therefore, the United States could never afford to endanger the Republic of Korea. The Cold War was starting, with NATO representing the Western European front and South Korea symbolizing the Asian front. The United States could have established military bases farther north, such as in Pyongyang, Wonsan, or even the Hamgyong province area. This would strategically allow military surveillance of Vladivostok in the Soviet Union, 3 northeastern Chinese provinces, and even Beijing. A large-scale operation to eliminate the remaining communist partisan forces in North Korea. Their main base would have been inevitable. There would have been countless partisans. The United States also needed Korea to stabilize quickly to keep China and the Soviet Union in check, so it's possible that the United States would have directly participated in the suppression operations. It appears probable that the Indo-Pacific strategy in use today originated in the late 1950s. A unified Korea would likely have been a key part of the United States maritime containment line in East Asia, alongside Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines. The United States would have made huge investments in Korea. After unifying by advancing north, Korea would have likely received substantial aid to rebuild the northern regions. International support organizations are expected to have been set up to rebuild destroyed railroads, factories, and agricultural infrastructure. Another key point is the global focus Korea would have garnered as a nation bordering China. A unified Korea advancing north would be at the forefront of the democracy versus communism ideological clash in Asia. This would quickly raise Korea's strategic position in Western media, United States politics, and the United Nations. In conclusion, if Korea had unified by advancing north, it would have held much greater geopolitical leadership and received significantly more support and attention from the United States and West compared to today. Then what would have happened to Kim Il-sung if unification by advancing north had succeeded? He probably would have formed a government in exile, but it wouldn't have lasted very long. China and the Soviet Union's support for Kim Il-sung would have been limited. At that time, Kim Il-sung was somewhat different from the Kim Il-sung we know from history today. At that time, Kim Il-sung was temporarily appointed as North Korea's leader. There was no reason to support Kim Il-sung, who lost North Korea due to a reckless war. Surely other talented leaders existed besides him, making supporting Kim unnecessary. So he probably established a government in exile and took the leadership position, but I don't think that government in exile would have lasted very long. Moreover, as the partisans faced increasing punishment, their influence would have diminished, eventually leading to their obscurity. He may have been ousted due to internal politics. We should also examine his relationships with China and the Soviet Union more closely. He likely had multiple disputes with China. To begin, let's examine China's situation. If China hadn't sent troops to the Korean Peninsula, it would mean that China's military strength remained intact. If China didn't send troops to the Korean Peninsula, it was planning to use that military force to attack Taiwan. Therefore, China might have moved toward invading Taiwan. The problem is, that's not so easy either. If China succeeded in invading Taiwan, it would mean that the United States had essentially given up on defending Taiwan. At that time, China had virtually no navy, unlike now. If China successfully invaded Taiwan, it would imply the United States didn't intervene, which is unlikely as the United States isn't foolish. Therefore, China would not have been able to intervene on the Korean Peninsula or invade Taiwan. Because of this, Mao Zedong might have been criticized by the pro-Soviet faction within the party for being passive and submissive, and could have faced a major political crisis. Because of this, I think there would have been great chaos within China. Even if North Korea had successfully unified with South Korea as a liberal democracy, the China-Korea conflict would have remained complex. On the contrary, conflict and tension between the two countries would have likely begun the moment they shared a border. First of all, for China, a unified Korea itself would have been seen as a strategic threat. Before unification, South Korea kept a distance from the 38th parallel and United States troops. After unification, the situation would change drastically. Korea is the sole United States ally sharing a direct border with China, connecting to the 3 northeastern provinces, the gateway to China's heart. As a result, China becomes extremely wary of the United States forces stationed in Korea for the sake of its border security. United States forces deployed in Pyongyang, Chongjin, and Haesan would have served as a surveillance outpost and base for intelligence operations and reconnaissance activities. For China, it would be like the United States installing cameras and flying drones right at their doorstep. In this situation, various factors could have sparked potential border conflicts. Koreans often think of Jiandao and Mount Baekdu, believing that Jiandao was historically Joseon's territory and that the 1909 Jiandao Agreement between Qing and Japan is not valid. After the northward unification, nationalism likely intensified, and following the national achievement of a unified Korea, there may have been strong demands for the recovery of Jiandao. Jiandao was the center of armed resistance, making it a region where claiming historical legitimacy is easy. This may have led political circles and certain groups in Korea to officially raise the issue of territorial recovery. In this case, China would have swiftly reacted by bolstering its troops in the border regions, potentially leading to recurrent military conflict crises. China has also demonstrated a willingness to go to war when it perceives threats to its national interests. Therefore, if a unified Korea strongly asserted its sovereignty in a border dispute with China, a local military conflict with China could have become a reality. As China and Korea increased their military near Heaven Lake on Mount Baekdu, accidental gunfights or clashes over setting up fences on Yalu River islets could have happened. The Korea-China border likely saw a historical pattern of recurring military friction. Today, Korea would look very different. Korea could have potentially reached a population of 100 million after the war, with the baby boom generation contributing to the significant growth. If Korea had implemented a strong population control policy, the outcome is uncertain. However, it's likely that the current population of the Korean Peninsula would have exceeded 70 million. Also, I think the conscription system would have continued. There are some people who say that if unification happens, Korea would switch to a volunteer military system, but even after unification, the next opponents would be the Soviet Union or China. It would be difficult to respond to them with a volunteer army because there simply wouldn't be enough troops. Therefore, I believe the conscription system would have persisted even after the war ended. We should also reevaluate President Lee Sung-man, who would be considered the third person to unify the Korean Peninsula after King Munmu of Silla and King Taejo Wanggeon. If he had avoided any unusual tactics to prolong his rule, he would have been remembered as a great figure of the Korean Peninsula and possibly received a national funeral. If he tried to stay in power longer, his evaluation would have worsened, but likely still more positive than now. Also, I think the regional conflict between North Korea and South Korea would have continued. What kind of world do you think would have unfolded if unification by advancing north had been achieved during the Korean War? Please share your thoughts in the comments. That's all for this video. Thank you.